Nyaya, Buddhism, and Shaiva Siddhanta. So you can see that the context in which I'm talking is that of classical Indian philosophy. And what I will do is three things. There'll be three parts to the talk. In the first part, I will give an account of the debate between Nyaya and Buddhism on the question of the existence of the self. I'll then look at a Nyaya argument against Buddhism, a Nyaya argument for the existence of the self, the Atman, against the Buddhist theory of no self, Anatmavada. And I will argue that it's not very difficult for the Buddhist to answer that argument, but I will then give three new arguments by Ramakanta, which I think are a bit stronger and which I think are more difficult for the Buddhist to reply to. Ramakanta's tradition was Shaiva Siddhanta, not Nyaya. So you can see the structure of the talk is really about the self-no self debate. This is a conference about consciousness. Well, we will observe as we go through the talk that consciousness is very central to this debate, and we'll see at many places where considerations of consciousness fit into this debate about the self and no self. I say there are three new arguments by Ramakanta. They're new in two senses. Firstly, in the sense that no one, to my knowledge, had made these arguments before Ramakanta. And secondly, in the sense that I had not seen these arguments referred to in the secondary literature. All I know is the secondary literature in English, but I haven't seen anywhere in that literature by Indian scholars or scholars outside India working on Indian philosophy that refers to these three arguments. In fact, Ramakanta is very little studied, and he does not tend to even get mentioned in histories of Indian philosophy. Okay, let's go straight to part one. When I try and explain what I think is at stake in this argument between Nyaya and Buddhism about the self, I like to make a triple distinction. I like to distinguish three things, three ways in which the self was envisaged by Nyaya, and three corresponding ways in which the self was denied and argued against by Buddhism. And we can call these self as unitary essence, self as the owner of qualities or the substance in which qualities inhere, in Sanskrit dravya, and finally self as agent, kartri. So let's go straight to the first of these, self as unitary essence. Now, what these two diagrams under Nyaya and Buddhism are intended to convey is that as we move through time, i.e., as we pass from the left to the right of these two diagrams, for Nyaya, we remain exactly the same thing. We persist through time. We remain numerically identical through time because we have one unchanging unitary essence. Whereas what the circles underneath Buddhism are intended to convey is that what we are in one moment is not what we are in the next moment. So for Buddhism, we have no self. We are rather just a stream of consciousness, a stream of moments of consciousness, and a parallel stream of moments of the body. And the claim that Buddhist makes, because of its theory of momentariness, kshanikavada, is that there's nothing that continues from one moment to the next. So in the first moment, I am a particular association of a mental state and a bodily state. And in the next moment, I'm an association of a different mental state and a different bodily state. So that's what those two diagrams were intended to convey. For Nyaya, we're one thing because we have a unitary essence which stays the same over time and never ceases to exist. For Buddhism, we're something different in every single moment. And in fact, it's the case for Buddhism that not only are we something different in every single moment, we're even something different in each moment. In other words, it's not only that we're plural over time, diachronically, we're also plural at one moment of time, synchronically. Because in every single moment, we are an association of a bodily state and 4 mental states. So these 5 things, 4 plus 1, are the Buddhist skandhas. So that's all for self as unitary essence. Now, how about self as owner of qualities or substance in which qualities inhere? Well, in this diagram, the big circle underneath Nyaya represents the Atman, that's the self, and these 5 small circles are things that Nyaya claimed to be qualities of the self, gunas of the self. Ichcha, dvesha, prayatna, sukha, dukkha, jnana, pleasure, pain, volition, desire, aversion, and consciousness. So in this first slide, consciousness came up because for the self, for Nyaya, we have a self and consciousness. For Buddhism, we don't have a self, we just have a stream of consciousness. Here in this slide, consciousness is featuring as a quality, a guna of the self. Consciousness is related to the self as quality to substance, or property to property possessor, dharma to dharmin. Whereas for Buddhism, consciousness and the other 4 skandhas exist together as part of a conglomeration. Sometimes the Sanskrit word for conglomeration is sanghata. But there's no substance to which those 5 skandhas belong, no owner of them, no substance in which they inhere. They just occur together at the same time and in the same place. So that's all for self as owner or substance. I guess one more thing I could say about this slide is that the Buddhist view here that there is no self-substance over and above qualities derives from, or is a particular instance of, a more general Buddhist view that there are no substances over and above qualities. So this big circle on the left could represent something like a mango fruit, in which case the small circles would represent the fruit's smell, color, taste, etc., the 5 qualities corresponding to our 5 sense faculties. Whereas a mango for Buddhism can be depicted by the diagram underneath Buddhism, where what a mango is for Buddhism is not one thing, but 5 separate things existing at the same time and the same place. Those 5 qualities, taste, touch, color, etc., without them inhering in any separate mango substance. There is no mango substance behind these 5 qualities that we experience. Nothing to which those 5 qualities belong. So let's move now to self as agent, which means both the agent of bodily actions, the instigator of bodily actions, and the agent of mental actions, the thinker of thoughts, the rememberer of memories, the perceiver of perceptions, cognizer of cognitions. Well, Nyaya and Vaisheshika philosophers often compared the self as the initiator of physical actions, the self as agent, to a puppeteer. Just as a puppeteer initiates the bodily movements of the puppet by pulling strings from above, so similarly the self initiates bodily movements by bringing them into existence from above, as it were. This comparison to the puppeteer is why I've drawn the diagram in this way, with the blue circles hanging down as if by strings from the line representing the self, and the blue circles represent mental or physical actions. Well, for Buddhists, this idea of some unconditioned agent standing above the chain of causes and effects, the chains of mental and physical events all causing each other, that is precisely what is denied by Buddhism. For Buddhism, there is nothing unconditioned that stands over and above the chains of causes and effect that the world consists of in the Buddhist view. So what is it for Buddhism that is the agent? Well, for Buddhism, to ask what the agent is simply to ask what the cause is. And so that means that the agent of this action, as I raise my hand, is simply the circle immediately preceding it in the diagram, i.e. the intention, the momentary intention that occurs in my mind stream, my stream of consciousness, immediately before I raised my hand. So if, let's say, 5 moments later, I raise my other hand, the agent of that action is not the same thing as the agent of the earlier action, because the agent of the earlier action has ceased to exist. It was a momentary intention. And so the agent, i.e. the cause of my second action, was something different, namely the momentary intention that preceded that second action. So that explains the difference between Nyaya and Buddhism on the question of the agent of physical actions. How about on the question of the agent of mental actions? Well, for Buddhism, there is no thinker over and above the thought. There is no perceiver over and above the perception. There is no rememberer over and above the remembering. The thing doing the perceiving or the thinking or the remembering is simply the stream of consciousness at that moment. So to express this in Sanskrit, we could say that for Buddhism, the grahaka, the thing doing the grasping or the perceiving, is simply jnana, is simply consciousness. Whereas for Nyaya, that's not the case. For Nyaya, the grahaka, the thing doing the perceiving, is the self, and that is separate from consciousness. It's related to consciousness in a relation of substance and quality. So I think that's enough on the background of this self-no-self debate between Nyaya and Buddhism. And this distinction I've made is not a distinction I've seen other people making. It's just my own distinction between self as unitary essence, self as owner or substance, and self as agent. But I think it follows quite naturally from the primary sources in Sanskrit. And one of the reasons I make it is because the 3 Buddhist denials of those 3 aspects of the self result from 3 different general Buddhist views. So the Buddhist denial of self as unitary essence is simply a special case of the Buddhist denial of anything non-momentary. So Buddhism holds that anything that exists is momentary, kshanika. Therefore, it straightforwardly follows that the self must be momentary, i.e., that there is no enduring self. The Buddhist denial of self as substance results as we saw from the more general Buddhist denial of substances over and above qualities. And this Buddhist denial of the self as agent results from the Buddhist view that there is nothing unconditioned standing over and above the network of causes and conditions that make up the world. Okay, so we can go now to part 2, and we'll look at what was the principal Nyaya argument for the existence of the self, at least up until the end of the first millennium, in such authors as Vatsyayana, Ujyotakara, Vachaspati Mishra, Jayanta Bhatta. For all of these authors, this argument, which is found in the commentaries on Nyaya Sutra 1110, is the principal argument for the existence of the self. So what is this argument? Well, it asks us to envisage a situation in which one experiences pleasure, that's depicted by P, from a certain kind of object that one has never experienced before. Let's say that somebody has never tasted a samosa before. They taste it for the first time, it gives them pleasure. And then sometime later, let's say a couple of weeks later, they see, depicted by S, another samosa. And so as a result, they feel desire for it. Well, this is something that both the Buddhist and the Nyayika, and probably all of us, can agree happens. We all feel desire sometimes for things which have caused us pleasure in the past. And the Nyayika argument is that this would not happen were it not for the case that the pleasure, the seeing, and the desire all shared one common agent. Why does the Nyayika feel entitled to claim that? Why does the Nyayika claim that we would not feel desire for objects that have caused us pleasure unless there was one common agent of the pleasure and the desire? Well, the Nyayika asks us to consider a situation in which we're dealing not with one person, but with two people, person X and person Y. Person X experiences the pleasure, and then sometime later, in another part of the world, let's say, a totally different country on the other side of the planet, person Y sees an object of that kind. Well, in that case, of course, person Y would not feel desire for the object that caused person X pleasure, because person Y would not even have access to that earlier experience of pleasure. So that pleasure would not be able to cause desire in person Y. So the Nyayika puts forward these two situations for our consideration and concludes that the reason desire arises in figure 1 but not in figure 2 is because we're dealing with two separate agents, two separate subjects, two separate people in figure 2, but just one in figure 1. Well, if that's the case, if the reason desire does not arise in figure 2 is because we're dealing with two separate subjects, well, then if one person were not, as depicted in figure 1, one continuous agent or subject, but were rather, as depicted in figure 3, and as maintained by the Buddhists, a plurality of separate subjects. If that were the case, if figure 3 were the correct way to depict one person and figure 1 was wrong, if the Buddhist view was right and the Nyaya view was wrong, then desire would not arise, because in figure 3 we're dealing with separate subjects, separate perceivers. separate cognizers. So that's the argument. Is the argument clear before we go on to consider how successful it is? Anyone need me to repeat anything about how the argument is working? Figure 1 is one person as depicted by Nyaya. Figure 3 is one person as depicted by Buddhism. Figure 2 is two people where the pleasure happens to one person and then the object is seen by a different person. And the reason that the D is crossed out in figure 2 is that both sides agree desire does not arise then. And the reason there's a question mark in figure 3 is because that is disputed. The Buddhist thinks that desire will arise there. The Nyayika thinks that desire will not arise there. Well, I don't think this argument is very difficult for the Buddhist to respond to, because the argument gains its plausibility from falsely likening figure 2 and figure 3. The argument gains its plausibility from arguing that the reason desire does not arise in figure 3 is because it did not arise in figure 2. You'll remember that stage of the argument. Well, the problem is that the Buddhist has very easy means at their disposal for distinguishing figure 2 and figure 3, because the Buddhist will just say that in figure 2, there's no continuous line of causation running from X's pleasure to Y's seeing, whereas in figure 3, there is a continuous line of causation running from the pleasure to the seeing. And that continuous line of causation means that the pleasure in figure 3, if it's a significant enough pleasure to be rememberable, will lay down a memory trace in the next moment, which Nyayikas call samskara and Buddhists call bhavana or vasana. And then, as the Buddhist stream of consciousness unfolds, as each moment causes a replica of itself or a very close replica in the next moment, that replica will include a replica of the memory traces that were contained in the previous moment. So this memory trace will be, as it were, passed along the chain, such that when you see the pleasurable object, that memory trace will be activated, the samskara will ripen, giving rise to memory of the earlier pleasure. So the seeing will be accompanied by awareness of the earlier pleasure, so desire will be able to arise in the next moment. So, as I say, I think it's not very difficult for the Buddhist to reply to this argument. And this appeal to memory traces, samskaras, vasanas, is not some ad hoc way in which the Buddhist just tries to get themselves out of this problem. Both the Nyayika and the Buddhists agree about the existence of these memory traces, and they both see them as the explanation not only for memory, but also for dreaming, and also for karma, for how a karmic fruit can take place at some distance in time from the action that laid down the trace of that karma, of that karmic. Yeah. Whenever one performs an ethically significant action, that action will lay down a trace, a samskara or a vasana in the next moment, and it will be that trace which gives rise to the karmic fruit subsequently. So these vasanas, samskaras, are accepted by both sides. So it seems fair enough for the Buddhists to appeal to them here in order to explain how desire can arise in figure 3. So the only way in which this argument could really be compelling is if it is definitely the case that in figure 2, the reason that desire does not arise is because we're dealing with two separate subjects. If that were the case, then the Nyayika would be correct in saying that desire would not arise in figure 3, because the Buddhist admits that in figure 3 we are dealing with separate subjects. But the Buddhist does not think that the reason desire does not arise in figure 2 is because we're dealing with separate subjects. The Buddhist has a different, rival explanation for why it is that desire does not arise in figure 2, namely that there is no chain of causation in figure 2. Since there is a chain of causation in figure 3, there's no reason that desire cannot arise in figure 3. So we can now turn to the last part, where I'll give 3 arguments by Ramakanta that I think are rather harder for the Buddhist, are more likely to cause some sweat to break out on the brow of the Buddhist, more likely to make the Buddhist a little bit nervous, or more likely to have to really force the Buddhist to think. Whereas in reply to that argument we've just seen, all the Buddhist has to do is just appeal to another well-known aspect of their own theory. So who was Ramakanta? He was writing in the 10th century in Kashmir, and at that time, Shaiva Siddhanta did not, as today, exist only in the Tamil-speaking part of India. At that time, in the 10th century, Shaiva Siddhanta existed all over India, including in Kashmir. And Ramakanta was a slightly older contemporary of Abhinavagupta and is quoted by Abhinavagupta. But Abhinavagupta belonged, of course, to the other branch of Shaivism, non-dualistic Shaivism, which is often misleadingly called Kashmir Shaivism. We can see why that's misleading just by the fact that we're dealing here with a Kashmiri author, Ramakanta, who was a Shaiva, but who belonged to the tradition of Shaiva Siddhanta. Now, what was Ramakanta's view? Well, his view can be illustrated by the following diagram. Whereas for Nyaya, there is consciousness, and then there's a separate self over and above that consciousness, in which consciousness inheres through samavaya. And whereas for Buddhism, there is just consciousness, there is no self. For Ramakanta, there is a self, but it is just consciousness. So Ramakanta holds that consciousness is enduring, persistent, not momentary. And for Ramakanta, consciousness endures over time, always in the same state. So it's actually both numerically and qualitatively unchanging. But for today, at least in the talk, I'm not going to talk more about Ramakanta's own view. We can come to that in the Q&A if you'd like. I'm going to talk about Ramakanta's arguments against Buddhism. Now, in his argumentation against Buddhism, Ramakanta starts by saying to the Buddhist, surely you Buddhists admit that as we proceed through life experiencing various different objects of perception, the perceiver of those objects remains always the same and appears to us, at least appears to us always the same. The Buddhist, of course, will not admit that the perceiver does remain the same. So the argument here is just about the way the perceiver appears to us. And Ramakanta says, is it not the case that you Buddhists agree that at least we appear to ourselves as the same perceiver over time, despite perceiving many different objects of perception? After all, we never seem to lose a sense that it's the same me. However, the same me who's perceiving all our perceptions and having all my experiences, perceiving all my perceptions, having all my experiences, it always seems to me that it's the same me who is fulfilling that role. Well, the Buddhist responds to this not by denying that. The Buddhist agrees, actually, that yes, we do have this sense of ourselves as one continuously existing person, one numerically identical entity persisting over time. The Buddhists even have a word for this, satkaya drishti, which refers to this sense of ourselves as one enduring being. And if we didn't have that, then there would be no need for a Buddhist path. We would all already have attained nirvana. The Buddhist path, the whole point of it is to target exactly this sense that we have of ourselves as one continuously existing being. So the Buddhist does not disagree with Ramakanta's first point, that we do have a sense of ourselves as persisting. But the Buddhist explains this away as a kind of illusion. What the Buddhist claims is that although we may think we're experiencing ourselves as one temporally extended being, in fact, what we're experiencing is a sequence of separate perceivers, but we're fooled by the rapidity with which each one follows the previous one and the similarity of each one to the previous one into thinking that we're experiencing one thing. So this Buddhist point can be illustrated by examples. Consider when a film of a person is projected onto a screen and you're looking at that projected image of the person. You think you're looking at just one continuously existing, uninterrupted person, but in fact, you're looking at a plurality of distinct film images, each one following the previous one so rapidly and resembling it so previously that you're not noticing the breakup. You think you're just looking at one thing rather than a sequence of momentary things. Or to use the example that the Buddhists in this period actually used, it's like looking at a very calm river and thinking that you're looking at just one unchanging chunk of water, when in fact you're looking at lots of different bits of water rushing by. So similarly, according to the Buddhist, when we have this sense of ourselves as existing, unbroken, unchanging, that is in spite of the fact that actually what's appearing to us is a sequence of distinct perceivers, but we're mistaken by the rapidity and the similarity of each to the next into thinking that we are experiencing one thing rather than many. So that is the Buddhist claim. And now we can look at Ramakanta's arguments, because his arguments target exactly that point. Now, the first argument, the Buddhist cannot provide an adequate account of how we superimpose oneness onto ourselves, how consciousness comes to be mistaken about its temporal extent. What does that mean? Well, we've seen that the Buddhist is claiming that we superimpose the concept of oneness onto what is actually plural. So consciousness, despite experiencing itself as continually broken up, discrete, momentary, superimposes oneness or permanence, temporal duration onto itself. Now, what Ramakanta says to the Buddhist about this is it's perfectly understandable that a person or a subject may be mistaken about the temporal extent of things external to them. A person or a subject may be fooled into mistaking a sequence of similar, rapidly coming into existence entities into thinking that they're looking at one thing. That's understandable. And that's illustrated by the examples of the river and the film images. But what you, Buddhist, are asking us to believe is that individual moments of consciousness can be mistaken about their own temporal extent. And it's much harder to see how or why that could be the case, where this mistake could creep in. And there are two halves to Ramakanta's argument here. The first half is to point out that the Buddhist examples don't illustrate what they need to illustrate. It's not the case in these examples that the film images, the film frames, are experiencing themselves as temporally extended. It's not the case that the bits of the river are experiencing themselves as unmoving despite moving. And so Ramakanta's first half of his argument is to say we shouldn't be fooled by these Buddhist examples into thinking that they make plausible how consciousness can come to be mistaken about its own temporal extent, how consciousness can superimpose oneness not onto something else but onto itself. The examples don't illustrate that. And Ramakanta's second point is to point out that this claim of the Buddhist actually is contradicted by other claims that the Buddhist makes. So the Buddhist claims elsewhere that every single moment of consciousness perceives itself non-conceptually through swasamvedana, through self-awareness. And the Buddhist claims that non-conceptual perception is always accurate. So it should follow that every moment of consciousness perceives itself accurately. So it should therefore follow from that if consciousness perceives itself as temporally extended, then it is temporally extended. That experience should be accurate. So in other words, it's very difficult to see how the Buddhist can explain away our sense of ourselves as temporally extended as mistaken. Now, the second argument also targets this Buddhist claim that we superimpose oneness onto what is actually plural. We superimpose temporal duration onto what is momentary. Let's take the standard example of superimposition in classical Indian philosophy, that of superimposing silver onto mother of pearl. When you see some mother of pearl and you mistake it for silver. Now, it's quite clear in that example that you would never mistake some mother of pearl for silver unless you had already experienced silver and so already possessed the concept of silver in order to superimpose that concept onto what is mother of pearl. But in a Buddhist universe in which absolutely everything is momentary, both perceivers and perceived objects, where or how could anyone have ever experienced something enduring in order to acquire the concept of duration, in order to superimpose that onto what is momentary? And now we come to the third and final argument, and this is the last thing I'll do before turning over for questions. Ramakanta's view is that consciousness can be one thing over time, can be temporally extended, and can be unchanging in its form over time, despite perceiving a plurality of distinct objects. Now, this was impossible for Buddhists. I should say that throughout this talk, I've been using Buddhism and Buddhists to refer only to one very specific branch within Buddhism, namely that which began with Vasubandhu's Abhidharmakosha Bhashya, which was continued by Dignaga, by Dharmakirti, and by all of Dharmakirti's followers. in that branch of Buddhism, the Sautrantika aspect of that branch maintains that the very way in which consciousness perceives an object is by taking on the form of that object. So it's as though consciousness, in order to perceive a yellow object, takes on that yellow form into itself. And this means that consciousness has a different form every time it's perceiving a different object. And that amounts to Dharmakirti, to consciousness being numerically distinct with regard to every single object. If it has a different swabhava with regard to each object it's perceiving, it must be a distinct thing with regard to each object it's perceiving. And therefore, we have a one-to-one correspondence between consciousness and objects. Whenever an object changes, that's a different perceiver. It's a different thing perceiving that new object. Now, Ramakanta's last argument here consists in pointing out to the Buddhist that the Buddhist does not hold consistently to this claim that there must always be a one-to-one correspondence between perceiver and perceived. What does that mean? Ramakanta's claim is that in the diachronic case, I'll explain what that means in a minute. Ramakanta's claim is that although in the diachronic case, the Buddhist maintains that whenever the object changes, the perceiver must change and become something different. Ramakanta points out that in the synchronic case, the Buddhist doesn't maintain that. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, Ramakanta's point is that if we're dealing with one moment, this is what I meant by the synchronic case. Consciousness, depicted by the small blank white circle. Consciousness is single, but it can perceive in that one moment a multicolored object. We sometimes perceive multicolored objects, i.e., we perceive a plurality of different colors. So Ramakanta points out that in that case, in one moment, the Buddhist is prepared to accept that we can have one single consciousness perceiving a plurality of objects. Well, if in one moment we can have one moment of consciousness perceiving a plurality of objects, then why, in the case of a temporal sequence, is the Buddhist not prepared to admit that we can have one temporally extended consciousness perceiving a sequence of different colors? If we can have a relation of one perceiver to many objects in one moment, why cannot we have a relation of one perceiver to many objects over time? Okay, that's it from my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for this very, very lucid and yet very systematic methodical analysis of Buddhist understanding of self and consciousness, and then how Ramakanta is challenging over these three very, very strong arguments. Very interesting presentation, sir. Thank you so much. I have some queries, but before that, I would like to request our participants that if you have any doubt, queries, or anything, you can raise your hand, and or you can also write it in our chat box. So please. Sir, just I want to know one thing. It's a very strong argument, what Ramakanta has raised against Buddhist understanding, and I think there are, such very important claims that we can raise against this idea of no self, because as if I'm not wrong, Ramakanta, the way he understands self, that it is identical with consciousness, that there is no such distinction between self and consciousness. So the very concept of self that Buddhist thinkers are refuting, it's something over and above consciousness. It's not that is identical with consciousness. And in that case, I believe that there is a complete misconception about the very idea of self, because every time when they are refuting one such an one enduring unbroken conscious self, that is something over and above our experience, that is not the very idea of self that Ramakanta is suppose like he is trying to make them understand. Or suppose we also don't have this idea in if we come to Advaita Vedanta, because when we talk about self, that is not the very self which is over and above our experience or consciousness. It is the same conscious experience, witness consciousness only. And interesting thing is that recently I saw in some works of Medial Beheri, who is very strongly supporting this very idea of no self, Buddhist concept of no self, against Dan Sahabi, challenging the idea of minimal self, and other strongly making a critique of that idea of self, minimal self, everything. So she was actually proposing or strongly advocating the idea of witness consciousness, that what is the momentary consciousness we have in Buddhism, what she calls that it is more like witness consciousness, though we also have the idea of witness consciousness in Advaita as a Sakshi Chaitanya. But I think she has a different perspective, different way of understanding it. So regarding that, I need your observation, your comments, that can we consider that momentary consciousness as a witness consciousness from Buddhist standpoint? Or what is your view on that? Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much. There was lots in that question. So, yeah, so as you point out, there's this very firm difference between two different ways of conceiving of the self. You can have the view of Ramakanta, and very similar to that is the view of Advaita, where the self is equated with consciousness. For Ramakanta and Advaita, the relationship between self and consciousness is not dravya and guna, not substance and quality. No, consciousness is the swabhava of the self for Advaita Vedanta and Ramakanta. It's the very nature of the self. So the self is not a substance existing over and above consciousness. No, the self just is consciousness. That's very different from the Nyaya view, where there's a sort of hierarchical relationship between self and consciousness. Self is the substance. The self in itself, for Nyaya and Vaisheshika, is jada, is actually insentient, because consciousness is ontologically distinct. And the self for Nyaya and Vaisheshika comes to be conscious under certain circumstances, when there happens to be a connection, sannikarsha, between Indriya and Artha and Manas and Atman. Under those circumstances, the self becomes consciousness, because there's the rise of a spark of consciousness, a momentary jnana, momentary moment of consciousness. But at the time of moksha, for Nyaya and Vaisheshika, the self loses any consciousness. Whereas for Advaita and Brahmakanta, the self remains of the nature of consciousness in the time of moksha, because a thing can never be separated from its nature. But a substance can be separated from its qualities. So you pointed out that difference, and you wondered if the Buddhist is talking at cross purposes. When the Buddhist refutes the self, you thought that, well, maybe the Buddhist is actually refuting the idea of a self over and above consciousness, a Nyayika self, but that doesn't do anything to refute the idea that consciousness is identical with the self. Well, some of the Buddhist arguments refute both kinds of self. Like Kshanikavada, all of the arguments for Kshanikavada they will refute any kind of self. Those Buddhist arguments will refute a self which is a Sakshi Chaitanya or the self which is a Dravya, because they will show that there is nothing that exists over time. So they will refute either of those kinds of self, since both of those kinds of self persist over time. Now, this point about Miri al-Bahari, that's very interesting. And I need, since you've now mentioned her, she's now gone up on my to-do list to read her, because I haven't read her yet. The last question you asked was whether was about her claim that consciousness in Buddhism is a witness consciousness. Yeah, I find that surprising. I find that quite hard to understand. So I'll have to read her about that, because to me, witness consciousness implies something that kind of exists over and above and separately from the things that it is witnessing. It's a bit like a light which is shining onto the objects and therefore illuminating those objects. And this light, which corresponds to the witness consciousness, is completely unaffected by the objects it's perceiving, just as a light is not affected by whatever objects come within its range. Whereas for Buddhism, that's definitely not the case. Consciousness is very much affected by objects it perceives. It takes on the very form of those objects, and is differentiated by those objects. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that question. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. There is one question in our chat box, so if you want to answer.
Chat. Now this is a bit odd. The when I click on chat.
Govinda Bhattacharya. Yeah, I'm reading, sir. If the Buddhist claims that a single cognition of many different objects is a conceptual cognition, unifying many objects rather than a direct perception, to me, that the cognition cannot be conceptual because all of the objects are simultaneously apprehended, that no such conceptual cognition is apprehended. Do you think it's correct?
Okay, yes, I found this comment in the chat. I'm not immediately understanding the force of it, so just give me a moment. So it begins by saying that if the Buddhist claims that a single cognition of many different objects is a conceptual cognition unifying many objects. So one distinction I want to make here is between two different questions. There's the question of what you mention in that first sentence in the chat, this question of a single cognition perceiving many different objects. There's a question in that case about whether that is conceptual or not. But actually, in my talk, the question of whether something is conceptual or non-conceptual came up in a slightly different context. In the context of not of one cognition perceiving many objects, but in the question of consciousness's perception of itself, our experience of ourself as temporally extended. Now, it's true, I suppose, that case of consciousness perceiving itself, I suppose that is, for the Buddhist, a case of a single cognition of many different objects. But the different objects there are the different moments of consciousness, the different momentary perceivers. So let's take it that your question is about that. Your question is about a single moment of consciousness perceiving, or is about the stream of consciousness perceiving itself. Now, in that case, there's a sense in which we are talking about a single cognition perceiving many different objects, where the objects are the momentary perceivers, the different moments in the stream. And your question is, you doubt whether the Buddhist can coherently claim that that is conceptual. And that's true. The Buddhist, that's true, yes. Now I'm understanding your question more. The Buddhist does claim that that's conceptual, and that is the point of difference between the Buddhist and Ramakanta. It comes down to this question of when we experience ourselves as temporally extended, is it a vikalpa? Is it conceptual? That's the Buddhist answer. Or is it pratyaksha and that direct perception? And that's Ramakanta's argument. And you're saying that the Buddhist is going to have difficulty claiming that it's conceptual because all of the objects are simultaneously apprehended. And this last part of the question, I don't quite understand. Is it possible you could you could unmute yourself and explain this second half of the question? Why is it that you think that it cannot be conceptual?
Govinda, if you are there, you can unmute and you can ask the question directly. Govinda.
The fact that Govinda talks in the second half of the question about all of the objects being simultaneously apprehended, that makes me think that Govinda is asking about the final slide where you're perceiving a multicolored object. Is that what you're talking about, Govinda, or are you talking about consciousness perceiving itself? Maybe Govinda can clarify that, but in the meantime, I see there is. Shall I move to another question in the meantime, Munmun?
Please, sir, please. There are two more questions.
Is consciousness related to the divine? Okay, that's a good question. Well, I would say that the answer varies with regard to different traditions. And in Advaita Vedanta, of course, there is no difference between Atman, Brahman, and consciousness. Consciousness is the very nature of the Atman, the very nature of Brahman. So in that sense, consciousness is related to the divine. But for Rama, and in non-dualistic Shaivism, the tradition of Abhinavagupta, you have something very similar. But in Ramakanta's Shaivism, I would say no, it's not. My consciousness is different from the consciousness of God. So Shaiva Siddhanta has a view of the relationship between God and the world and consciousness that is very similar to the view of Nyaya about the relationship of Ishvara and individual souls and the world. For Ramakanta and for Nyaya, the metaphor about the divine, Ishvara, and God's creation of the universe is that of a pot being created by a potter. God is equivalent to a potter, but God is separate from the pot. The material out of which the pot is made is separate from God. And that's so in that case, in the view of Nyaya and Ramakanta, God is just the nimitta karana of the universe, is just the efficient cause of the universe. Whereas for Advaita and for non-dualistic Shaivism, God is both the nimitta karana and the upadana karana. So God is also the material out of which the Shiva is the material out of which the universe is made for Abhinavagupta and for others in the tradition of non-dualistic Shaivism. And Atman, Brahman, well, it's a bit more complicated in Advaita because actually there's a sense in which the world is not made of Atman, Brahman, since the world is unreal, Atman, Brahman is real, Atman, Brahman is conscious, the world is unconscious. But yeah, so I just wanted to make the point there that for Ramakanta, there's a firm difference between individual souls with their consciousness and the consciousness of Ishvara. And even if you attain moksha in Shaiva Siddhanta, that does not mean that you lose your separate identity. No, you remain an individual separate from all other individuals and from the divine, even in the time of moksha. Next question. Does the negation of a substantial self imply the negation of subjecthood in the Buddhist context? No, I don't think so. No, I think the Buddhist would just say that there's a plurality of subjects, that each moment of consciousness is a subject. And so whereas the self theorists identify the self and the subject, Buddhists just say that no, the subject is not the self. The subject is each particular moment of consciousness. So we have a separate subject in each self. I think that's how I would depict the Buddhist view, the Buddhist question of subjecthood, the Buddhist attitude to subjecthood. This is a question from Priyanka. In which text is the Ramakanta Buddhist debate presented? So three texts by Ramakanta. One is called the Nareshwara Prakasha, Nareshwara Pariksha Prakasha. Nareshwara, that's Nara Ishwara Pariksha, is a text by Sadyodhyoti, meaning the examination Pariksha of Nara and Ishwara. So that was the Nareshwara Pariksha by Sadyodhyoti. And Ramakanta's text, in which he gives these arguments, is a commentary on that called the Nareshwara Pariksha Prakasha. His commentary is called the Prakasha. Then another text in which Ramakanta gives these arguments is the Matanga Parameshwara Vritti. The Matanga Parameshwara is a Shaiva Siddhanta Agama, and in his commentary on that, he gives the arguments. And finally, he gives these arguments in a text called the Paramoksha Nirasa Karika Vritti. This is Ramakanta's Vritti commentary on the Paramoksha Nirasa Karika, and that too is by Sadyodhyoti. So that means the karikas, the verses which refute nirasa, para moksha, means the ideas about moksha put forward by others, para. And if you want secondary literature on these, both my first book is about the Nareshwara Pariksha Prakasha. And my first book is a translation of these passages from the Nareshwara Pariksha Prakasha. And in many footnotes, I give translations from the other two texts I've just mentioned. And then my second book is a full critical edition and full translation of the whole of the Paramoksha Nirasa Karika Vritti. So if you go onto my academia.edu page, you can see those two books, and you can see many articles about Ramakanta.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. I have two more things to, I just want some clarification from you, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. One is that do you think that there are two prominent views about the very concept of self we have in Indian philosophy? One is substantial self, another is experiential self. So when Buddhist thinkers are criticizing or denying, they are mainly trying to refuse that substantial notion of self, rather than the experiential notion of self, experiential notion that the very idea of self as a consciousness. Do you think they are refusing only the substantial notion of self, or they are refusing both the two concept, substantial notion and the experiential self?
This sounds like an interesting distinction, but I'm not sure I'm totally clear about it. Do you have different Sanskrit terms for substantial self and experiential self? Or could you explain where
No,
you have
by substantial self,
some
I
traditions?
mean the very idea of self we have in Naya.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
yeah, in Naya or in Vaisheshika, like Descartes' self, cogito. Or substantial self, by that I mean the very self as an understanding of self as a consciousness, nothing apart from self consciousness. I mean, self is not something beyond consciousness, it is the very consciousness itself. Like suppose I think Ramakanta is talking about it, or Advaita Vedanta.
Hmm.
So do you think that Buddhism is denying both these two notions of self, or it is just refusing the substantial notion of self?
Yeah, okay, now I understand the difference. Yeah, substantial self means self as a substance, self as a dravya. An experiential self means a self which is equated with consciousness. Yeah, I think the Buddhists definitely are refuting both of these. So I'm a bit puzzled by this Miri al-Bahari view. If she is claiming that the Buddhists are only refuting the substantial self but not the experiential self, that sounds very strange to me. I think the Buddhists would also be surprised by that. I think the Buddhists certainly would have seen themselves as refuting both kinds of self.
Actually, Mary Albahari, she didn't make any such distinction, but she was just, I mean, claiming that the when they are refusing the very idea of self, they are not refusing the idea of witness consciousness. There is a perspectival self, perspectival consciousness, which is always there. So that she has termed as witness consciousness, the perspectival consciousness. I mean, there is a personal. I mean, there two. There are actually two distinctions she made. But what I remember is that witness consciousness as a perspectival self, which is always there, and that is like something. It's not like that kind of substantial self we have in Naya.
Yeah,
And
no, I think the Buddhists would definitely not agree that there's any self that's always there, even if it's just a perspectival or experiential self. The Buddhists' arguments in favor of momentariness will wipe out that kind of self just as much as a substantial self, I think.
what then is the very idea of Ala Vigyana, sir? I mean, there is so much discussion about the Ala Vigyana.
Hmm.
So, what is that then? Is it not some kind of cosmic awareness or?
Well, my understanding is that it's not cosmic awareness because everyone's Alaya Vijnana is different from everyone else's Alaya Vijnana. And certainly in the tradition of Dharmakirti, Vasubandhu Dignaga Dharmakirti, which I'm talking about, insofar as they even mention Alaya Vijnana, they regard it definitely as momentary. So there may be some other branches of Buddhism, which maybe Miri al-Bahari has in mind, or maybe you have in mind, where this Alaya Vijnana is sometimes portrayed as being almost like a cosmic consciousness. That may be the case. But in this tradition of Buddhism that I know, which is the tradition of Buddhism that was engaged in by all of the non-Buddhists, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, the Shaivas, Mimamsakas, the kind of Buddhism they were engaged with was this Dharmakirtian Buddhism, uh, which didn't begin with Dharmakirti because it stretches back to Dignaga and Vasubandhu. But in that tradition, no, I think there's a very firm denial of any kind of self, and the Alaya Vijnana, insofar as it's ever mentioned, would be very clearly distinguished from a self. But there is this tradition called the Tathagata Garbha tradition of Buddhism, and there it may be the case, the kind of thing you're talking about. There they seem to come very close to accepting some kind of self. Um, yeah.
What is that, sir? That Tathagata Garva?
Yeah, Tathagata Garbha. I don't know very much about it, but it's one branch of Buddhism which didn't really, I think, uh, prosper or flourish much in India, but it
Yeah.
came to be important in, I think, Chinese Buddhism.
There is so much reference of that in Lankavatara Sutra.
Yes,
The
there you go. Exactly. Exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's why, because I what I understood there, they by Alaya Vigyana, they have, I mean, understood that Tathagata Garbha also. So
Right.
there is not much difference. But of course, they talk about different other concepts like Manas, like Vigyana. These are not like as identical with Ala Vigyana or Tathagata Garbha. But Tathagata Garbha is the very Ala Vigyana. I mean, that is the claim or that is the argument we see there.
Hmm. I see.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for
Well,
sharing your reflections, views about these things. And participants, if you have any other query, you can raise your hand.
yeah, thank you very much for all of your questions. And please feel free to send me an email. You could get my email address from Munmun Mam.
Okay, sir. I think there is no more question. Then I want to thank you once again on behalf of the Center for Indian Knowledge System. We extend our sincere thanks and gratitude to you for giving us your valuable time, for also enriching us. Thank you so much, sir. It's
Well, thank
really,
you. Yeah.
really an honor to have you. Uh, Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great opportunity for me to be able to talk like this to all of you. And I enjoyed your questions very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We have our next speaker, Professor Madhumita Madam. I saw that Madam join, but let me check. Dr. Nongnen, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Uh,
Ma'am, I couldn't find
I
Professor
saw
Madhumita.
Madam once. I saw her name. Uh,
As of now, she's not here. I think she left.
she has joined, I think. Madam, Professor Madhumita, Madam, can you hear me? She has joined, but
Madam has joined, yes.
yeah.
She's yet to put on video and audio. So
Professor Madhumita Madam, can you hear me? Are you there, madam?
Madam is here, but madam is here
Madam,
to put on
please
his.
unmute yourself. Yeah. Hello, madam. Good evening. হ্যাঁ ম্যাডাম, হ্যাঁ ম্যাডাম, হ্যাঁ আপনি জয়েন করে। আচ্ছা, হবে হবে হবে। ও ঠিক আছে, হবে ম্যাডাম, ঠিক আছে। Madam has some problem related to her microphone, so she's joining again.